You very, very much indeed for that exceptionally generous introduction. But I do want to begin by offering a word of caution about at least one thing that you said. I do know of one other recently prominent individual who is the proprietor of degrees from both Harvard and Yale. His name, I regret to tell you, was George W. Bush. Enough said. In giving political speeches on my home territory in recent years, I would always begin by saying that I was a great follower of President Bush, that I'd followed him to Andover Preparatory School, followed him to Harvard and to Yale. I'd followed him to Texas, but then I stopped. There was something else that resonated in what you said, which I need to recount, that on the occasion of my father's 90th birthday, the Kennedy School at Harvard gave a glorious party, and I was called upon to give a toast. So I got up and said that I had always hoped for the opportunity to be able to say that my father's contributions to economics would rank with those of Keynes and Mill, specifically John Neville Keynes and James Mill. And then I said, tonight I have the opportunity, but of course I lacked the nerve. And later got a message from the former chairman of the economics department at Harvard that it was a very good line, and it was unfortunate that nobody had a clue as to what I meant. I, like my father, am a disciple of Keynes and got my formative training in economic theory at the University of Cambridge. And I was a friend of the financial theorist Hyman Minsky, who had important influence over my work at a certain stage. And as you've heard and as you know, I do have that senior relative and veteran speaker at this institute who made his literary career 54 years ago with the publication of a small volume called The Great Crash, 1929. And for these reasons, and for some others that I will talk about briefly, I find myself temperamentally totally unsurprised by the crisis. Is to say, in that respect, I'm very much unlike the overwhelming majority of the professional and academic economics community, at least in the United States, which had persuaded itself over the course of the last 30 years that the development of economic theory, the advance of efficient financial markets, the implementation of these marvelous quantitative risk management models in financial institutions, and the deep wisdom of central banks, which had learned that they should focus only on inflation and ignore all other economic objectives, had combined to give us a world in which the problem of crisis and depression had simply been solved and would never return again. And this sort of twilight of illusion went on for quite a long time, but it has, of course, been washed away by the events of the last 18 months. And the result of that is that the position of the profession that I joined 30 years ago has been eroded practically to the vanishing point. And that, for someone who's spent an entire career on the margins working on obscure problems like financial crises, is a minor miracle that this has happened before I reached my dotage, because it has given me a degree of respectability that I had never before thought possible. To the point, I have to tell you that when the Council on Foreign Relations in New York a few weeks ago held a meeting to do a historical reappraisal of the New Deal, a meeting which had been designed by the journalist Amity Shlaes and was deeply dominated by those who were arguing that the Great Depression resulted from the New Deal rather than the other way around. At the last minute, they decided they needed to add me to the program in order to make this event at the Council on Foreign Relations respectable. I said I would be honored to help out that institution in that way. The whole thing reminds me of the day on August 15th, 1971, when Richard Nixon imposed wage and price controls. And the Washington Post telephoned my father, who had run price control for Roosevelt in the Second World War quite successfully, and asked him for his view, and he said, I feel like the streetwalker who's just been told that not only is her profession legal, but the highest form of municipal service. In some ways, I think the crisis is going to have a very interesting, potentially very interesting effect on the way the United States does business in the world, and the way in which economists in the United States have to think about the world. And that is that it may bring the U.S. back into contact with the experience of much of the world. Because, after all, even though there were some relatively small financial crises that emerged in the United States in the 1970s, and I worked on two of them early in my career as a member of the staff of the Banking Committee of the House of Representatives, that is to say, the fiscal crisis of the city of New York and the rescue of the Chrysler Corporation in 1979. Beginning in the early 1980s, there was a substantial asymmetry and dichotomy in the world in which the problem of financial crisis was something that was largely felt overseas, say outside, beginning in 1982 with the crisis in Latin America and Africa, the Third World Debt Crisis, which originated or was precipitated by monetary policy events in the United States, but nevertheless had its harshest effects elsewhere in the world. And then moving on in the 1990s to the Asian crisis of 1997 and the Russian crisis of 1998, or the Mexican crisis, I should say, also of 1994-95. All of these things were events which professional economists working elsewhere found that they had to deal with on a daily basis, but those working in the United States found it possible largely to ignore by creating, in a sense, an intellectual dichotomy between the economics of developed and the economics of developing or stable and unstable countries. And it's clear that, or at least it seems clear to me, that one of the consequences of the events of the last couple of years is going to be, or should be, to force us to reappraise that way of approaching the world, and perhaps to begin to treat the world as an integrated system in a serious way, and understand that there are not national models of development or idiosyncratic policies that can trump or dominate the global forces that affect us all, which may originate in particular parts, and particularly in the largest and most financialized economies, but which are essentially a common planetary problem. I want to come back to that because I have some observations about how that thought applies to Europe, but I'll come to those a little later on. Let me talk for a minute about the origins of this crisis, just to, in some sense, perhaps put my thinking on that topic the same plane or wavelength as yours. I think it is very customary in the discussions of this issue, obviously for everybody to acknowledge that the crisis grew out of problems in the housing market, in the mortgage market, and particularly in the securitization of subprime residential mortgages in the United States. But the characterization of that process strikes me as one which has been subjected by economists in particular to a certain unconscious whitewashing, a process that my father would have described by the phrase innocent fraud, perhaps. I had the privilege this morning here in Dublin, for example, of listening to Paul Krugman, who's a friend and an ally on most things, give his description and analysis of these issues. And I noticed that there was one word that did not come up in the way he built his description of the problem, and that word was fraud. And it seems to me that the introduction and of that concept and coming to grips with it is an exceptionally important piece of understanding both what happened and what the problem may be with the policy approach that's being taken to the crisis now in the United States and perhaps elsewhere in the world. The point I would make is that from the start to the finish, the entire process of housing finance became infested with financial fraud, something that goes well beyond the ordinary euphoria of a speculative moment. There was fraud in the origination of the mortgages and in the documentation of those mortgages. Fraud on a systematic and vast scale. Mortgages issued to people who could not document their incomes or would not do so, to people whose credit ratings were non-existent or bad, on the basis of houses against the collateral of houses whose values were systematically inflated by appraisers who were hired for their willingness to issue such systematically inflated appraisals, by lenders who set the payments in such a way as to be the maximum that the borrower could probably service over a course of 2 or 3 years, with the lenders knowing very well that the loans would be reset in 2 or 3 years, that the payments would go up, and that the borrowers would be in difficulties. And if the borrowers questioned this, they were told not to worry because housing prices never fall and they could always refinance. All right? The lenders knew or should have known that those representations were fraudulent. And in many cases, it went beyond that you can examine the documentation and find evidence that the lenders were aware that we were dealing with flipping schemes and things of that nature. But the fraud went on into the underwriting and the representation of the character of these mortgages to the ratings agencies, and the willingness of the ratings agencies to issue against certain tranches of the resulting securities a AAA rating without examining the underlying documentation or appraising the quality of the loans. They asked that the ratings be issued on the basis of statistical appraisals of the probability of default. Appraisals which by their nature were invalidated by the changing character of the mortgages themselves. And the fraud was abetted by public authorities, abetted by the government in power, in a process that I call, rather as brutally as I could in the title of my book, the predator state. A government whose chief regulator, the director of the Office of Thrift Supervision, in this process, came to a press conference early in the term of the previous administration with a stack of copies of the Code of Federal Regulations and a chainsaw. Right? This is a message to the business press in this area, a clear, an unambiguous, and not a subtle message that the underwriting of these securities would be desupervised and that the aggressive players in the business could get away with what they wanted to get away with, which they then took advantage of. And there were political reasons why this was done, because it obviously boosted the Construction of homes and the share of home ownership. It gave the president a chance to claim that he was promoting an ownership society and helped to improve employment and generally increase the popularity of the administration for as long as it lasted. The FBI warned in public that an epidemic of mortgage fraud was underway. Nothing was done to provide the resources for investigation and prosecution to stop it. There was a whole language. Buyer's loans, no-doc loans. Neutron loans, that's my favorite one. Straight out of the nuclear age. Loans which destroy the people but leave the buildings intact. Language is important because it tells you that the people working in the industry knew what they were about, that they were not, in fact, innocent parties here, all thinking that things would turn out well. They were quite aware that they were purveying defective products, and they purveyed them, of course, on a massive scale to the world markets. In the case of one institution, IndyMac in California, which was taken over by federal authorities in the last year of the Bush administration, that was a bank that issued $90 billion of subprime securities and sold $75 billion into the public markets. It kept $15 billion, which could be appraised when the federal authorities took the bank over, and of that $15 billion, I believe the correct figure is that $12 billion was written off. And of course, if the bank knew what it was doing, the $15 billion it kept was probably better than the $75 billion that it sold. Okay? This feeds into something else that I think is a feature of the contribution of conventional economics to the disaster and to the rise of the predator state. And that is a complete misunderstanding of the role of regulation in modern economic life. A view that there is an inherent opposition between government and market, and that the role of government should be minimized so as to keep the burden off the back of business. A view which completely mischaracterizes what regulation is for and does in a sophisticated market society. My argument is that without regulation which is considered credible and trustworthy, markets which require the trust of the ultimate consumer cannot and will not exist. It is only the regulations that assure us that the lettuce is clean that give us confidence to put it on our plates and eat it. And in societies where such regulations are not credible, no one eats lettuce. Very simple. And the same is true in the financial markets. It was the trustworthiness of a system of essentially enforced fair dealing that caused financial institutions to be willing to do business with each other, let alone the broad public to be willing to do business with them. And that is, of course, what collapsed beginning in August of 2007. It was the confidence that the institutions had that their counterparties had been governed in a way which permitted them to be trustworthy business partners. That was the collapse of the interbank lending market, and ultimately, of course, it led to a collapse of the credit mechanism and the breakdown of the institutions, including the serial collapse of the investment banking sector, which, of course, precipitated into a panic when it became clear that there were limits to what the federal government would do to rescue institutions whose deposits were not insured. And the result, of course, was a violent slump, a slump of such violence that we have not seen it in the professional lifetime of living economists, my biological lifetime, and indeed in the history of the statistical record of the post-war period. Slump which can be compared quantitatively, at least in the beginning phases, to the early 1930s in terms of its effect on production and trade, though not on overall GDP for two reasons. Government sectors are much larger than they were then, and the service sector is much larger, and therefore the overall effect on GDP is substantially smaller. But in terms of the effect on those parts of the economy that are most dependent on the credit mechanism, it's entirely comparable. I want to talk a little bit about the response to the crisis, which is proceeded basically in three phases. And I think each of them can be assessed somewhat independently. So I'll just say a little bit about each. The first, of course, was the moment of panic, the clear revelation that the government was unprepared for what was happening and really did not know what to do. There was a lot of puzzled interpretation of the fact that the Treasury Department in the United States sent a bill that was exactly 3 pages long to the Congress in late September of 2008, asking for $700 billion, and please do not supervise how we spend it. Something which led some people to believe that this was an incredibly audacious power grab, in effect a coup d'etat. But I think the simpler explanation is that 2 lawyers met over a weekend, and this was the best that they could come up with, given that they hadn't prepared anything. And they kicked it down over to the Congress, recognizing full well that the Financial Services Committee in the House of Representatives would rewrite the bill, and the 3 pages would become first 103 pages, which was voted on and defeated a few days after it was introduced, and then ultimately 480 pages, which was sufficiently long for the Congress to consider passing it. That process actually was a hurried and deeply, for members of Congress, traumatic one. But it was effective in getting a range of authorities to the relevant agencies and permitting them to act in ways which were ultimately sensible. The first idea, which grew out of the ideas of economists, which was you would buy back the defective assets at some price created by some market mechanism which had to be invented, was a total non-starter because it built on the notion, the economist common fallacy, which was also could be applied to their ideas about what would happen when the Soviet Union collapsed, that market mechanisms could be built out of nothing. Reverse auctions and things of that nature. And the Treasury Department, composed ultimately of realists, came to the conclusion that this was not possible, and what you had to do was to increase the insurance limits on deposits, quell the panic in the banking sector, nationalize the commercial paper market so that businesses could get their basic liquidity, and if you did anything with the banks, buying them was much more sensible than trying to buy their assets, because at least their shares had a price. And that's, of course, what they did. And the effect of that, I think, was as intended by realists in the government, which was to get the country through the period from the early October to the 21st of January, when a government was effectively disappearing, losing power, losing effectiveness, and losing the will to react, and into a new administration, which at the time we didn't know who it would be, but either McCain or Obama would have been preferable because they would have brought a team in that was at least had some future in front of it and some incentive to act effectively. So I think one can give the both instinctive and discretionary actors in that process some credit for preventing things from getting much, much worse as they might otherwise have done. The second big phase in the response mechanisms is fiscal. And it's far more important in terms of the functioning of the underlying economy, given that the institutional structures remained intact. We, on the progressive and Keynesian side, are trained not to be afraid of very large numbers. Right? You can always make a deficit number look terrifying by reporting it in dollar terms, but then when you turn it into a percent of GDP, it comes back under control. Even so, many of us, of my colleagues, did not think that the political system would be willing to tolerate deficits that look percentages of GDP in 2 digits, 10 or more. And yet, it's very clear that that is what has happened, is happening, will happen, and that the effect of this on the functioning of the underlying economy is powerfully stabilizing. say the rise in the government's ability to issue debt and act on it is roughly offsetting the collapse in private credit. It's a very big and impressive number. Fall in taxes, increase in spending. And that is before you feel the effect of any discretionary action. It's simply because the institutions were created in the Keynesian era, progressive income tax, unemployment insurance, food stamps, disability, and other assistance, which generates increased expenditure and reduced taxation in response to the violence of the slump. And then on top of that, it turns out that in spite of all of the years of economic miseducation, the government of the United States has a basic Keynesian instinct. When unemployment starts going up, they want to spend more money. And it was possible to put together the largest expansion bill, so-called stimulus package, in the post-war history of the country, and to do so in 3 weeks. It's an impressive legislative accomplishment, actually, and that was put in place in the early weeks of the Obama administration. I thought that bill was too small, but I'm a purist. I was working out what it should be in relation to the scale of the slump. And from a political standpoint, there was no way to have an effective response to the scale of the slump. It was limited by political considerations, by ideological considerations, by matters of the technical input placed into the process by agencies like the Congressional Budget Office. Everything was geared to making it smaller than it should be. But it was still pretty large in comparison to anything they'd ever done before. And that will be felt and is being felt. The third phase of the response is the bank plan, which has taken up an enormous amount of time and political energy, the Geithner plan, and which became, ultimately, a scheme to take the bad assets off the books of the banks, move them over to public-private partnerships, and let them sit there in the hope that they would recover value and that meanwhile the banks would begin to lend again. And I think this is highly defective in most respects, the worst piece of the program. Defective because the assumption that the banks will start lending simply when you give them cash and clearing up their books is simply unfounded. Banks do not lend because they have extra cash and it's spilling over outside of their doors like water out of a bathtub. Banks lend when they have borrowers they have confidence in. Borrowers have to come in and apply for credit. They have to be willing to buy things. These conditions do not apply. They have to have collateral. And in a massive collapse of asset values which has occurred, forget it. It's going to be a while before the power of the borrower is there to match the will of the lender, even if the lender has a will, which is another open question. And secondly, there is the question of what happens to those assets, and that'll come back to my point about fraud. The Treasury Department has been unwilling to look and ascertain for itself just how prevalent the problem of fraud may have been. We have some evidence on this. We have some surveys. We have some examinations, but we do not have a systematic evaluation. And my view is, backed by the opinion of a ratings agency that looked at it and independent investors who have some sense of this, is that there would be no market for these assets if they were examined for loan quality. The market only existed because the ratings agencies vouched for them in the first place. That's not going to happen anymore, and so they have to be evaluated on the strength of what the loan documents say, and the loan documents do not provide a basis for an independent investor to have any confidence in them. And that being so, my view is that the idea that the loans would recover value is fallacious, and what would happen if the partnerships were implemented would be essentially a delayed transfer of the losses to the Treasury, with no reform in the banking sector. And to me, that is, of course, problematic politically because it boosts the government debt for no productive purpose, and problematic economically because it leaves you with a sector which is prone to make the same mistakes and conduct the same misconduct as it did before. This apparently has collapsed now, and so I don't know what's going to happen. But I think the basic motivation of the government remains the same, which is to maintain the banking institutions alive, to keep them operating. And it seems to me that, while not necessarily getting in the way of stabilization, is a real problem for an effective and sustainable recovery going forward. To sum up this piece, I don't want to be unremittingly negative. I think the institutions remained intact, and in some respects, they acted appropriately in response to the crisis. The larger structures of a Keynesian state functioned as they should function, giving us fiscal stabilization. We're seeing a liquidation of inventories, which should put some limits on the depths of the slump. We're seeing increased savings in the household sector. Gives them money to spend and money to save and money to service their debts with. Some improvement of confidence, and the possibility that production will start to recover within a reasonable time frame. I'm not going to put a limit on it. That would be unwise and subject me to a kind of peer review that I want to avoid. But are we talking 3 months, 6 months, or a year? I don't know. But within a reasonable time, unless something further very bad happens. At the same time, nothing about this suggests that the response is going to deal with the human dimension of the crisis in any way which will satisfy or return hope to the underlying population. Employment, catastrophically falling, will continue to fall and will not recover, and when it stabilizes, the unemployment rate will stay high for a long time because people will come back into the labor market who've left it. Housing in a long-term state of oversupply, and therefore a long-term crisis of asset values, which will affect the possibility for revival of the credit market. A deep and unrelieved crisis of the states and localities from California to New York, with serious implications for social services going forward. And again, as I've mentioned, the future of banking is uncertain. And that's just the United States. Let's talk a little bit about how this plays out in the larger global community, and particularly here in Europe. It's obvious that the crisis was transmitted to the rest of the world in part through the vectoring of the securities themselves, in part through the collapse of confidence and the panic, in part through the collapse of demand and therefore of trade and production. But it's also, I think, fair to say that once the crisis got going, it swept other institutional fragilities in its wake and created a separate center of crisis here. The problems of the carry trade from New York through the European banks to Eastern Europe, the problems of mortgages issued effectively in Swiss franc or euro and payable in forint or kuna or zlotys. Great business while those currencies were rising on the back of an increased flow of inward foreign direct investment, but very much more difficult when they start to fall. And in effect, the mortgage burdens go up just as they do when a subprime mortgage resets, even though there is no element of fraud in the underlying issuance of the mortgages. Deep problems in banks which have leverage ratios that are higher than those even in the United States, and liabilities in currencies that suddenly become scarce, as the dollar did in the late part of last year, a problem which was only relieved by the issuing of $600 billion of currency swaps by the Federal Reserve. Europe has some advantages. With a larger government sector, it's better buffered. But it has some grave disadvantages as well. And these occur, I think it's fair to say, on the structural, institutional, constitutional plane. The United States can react to the crisis with administrative measures and with legislative measures, and when those decisions are taken, action will follow. But in the European case, what are we talking about? Emergency meetings of finance ministers over weekends with consensus required, and consensus, by the way, not available, so that it becomes very difficult to get a coordinated discretionary action on the scale that's required. And in addition to that, I don't know to what extent the European Central Bank is actually constrained by the charter, which may be by now something of a dead letter. But when you've written the charter for the central bank, which says it should only focus on inflation, it does become a little bit awkward if the problem becomes one of a massive deflation, depression, and rise of unemployment, and something has to be done about it. And that suggests to me that the Keynesian regions of the world, which will have the more effective responses, although perhaps it's almost surely not adequate to get us out of this anytime soon, are the US and China, and not the European community taken as a whole. And I think the consequences of that, obviously, for those countries which are most deeply affected, of which this is one, but others on the periphery, Spain and Greece and in the East, are dramatic, and there's no reason to expect that they won't be long-lasting. And much of the same issue that we have in the context of a state like California are going to be played out in the European context as well. They're at least analogous. The California problem is that the state's revenues are inadequate. Its services are under political attack, and the actions it will have to take to balance its budget constitutionally will require it to aggravate the economic problem of the country as a whole by diminishing people's incomes and increasing their taxes. Meanwhile, it's a Republican governor with a Democratic president, Democratic Congress, and they don't particularly care to bail him out. But the interest of the country as a whole is that the state should, in fact, be bailed out, and that this problem should be avoided by dropping, for the moment, the political issues or the recriminations over past behavior. But you can see the same scenarios being played out here. Will the recovery of the Keynesian regions, and particularly the United States, suffice to create a recovery for the world? Obviously, it helps if there is such a recovery. But I think there are dangers and imponderables, both with the presumption that there will be a recovery and with the presumption that it will have those effects. The first one I think I've dealt with adequately, which is the problem of debt, the liquidity preference of households, the risk aversion of banks, and the problem of collapsed collateral all suggest that the second phase of the recovery, what follows upon the effects of a fiscal expansion, may just not be present for a long time. The administration has basically decided to follow the path that the first Bush administration, senior Bush administration, followed in the late 80s, early 90s, of allowing the banks to earn income by borrowing from the central bank at zero and lending back to the Treasury at 3 or 4%. It's great work if you can get it, by the way. I recommend banking to you as a profession right now if you're still looking for something to do. Get a charter and get into that. But that's not going to generate expansion or recovery of lending to the household sector. There's a problem of globalization. As I say, we've got capital destruction in this slump, and when the recovery comes, the demand will go elsewhere, and the elsewhere where the channels of trade are dug most deeply is obviously to the east. So the recovery will tend to be felt in Korea and Japan and China before it comes over here. And perhaps more seriously than that, I would be troubled by the fact that we are clearly failing to deal with our problems of energy security, energy supply, and energy consumption. In this moment of crisis, we are not putting the energy and the determination into dealing with that needs to be done. And the result is that we're clearly vulnerable to a short-term return to high, particularly oil prices, but also perhaps other commodities. And if the speculative forces which contributed to that last year are not quelled, this could all happen quite rapidly. We've already seen effectively a doubling of the dollar price of oil. And should it go much further, and I'm not certain that it will, there may be some reason to believe the Saudis will stabilize things, but should it go much further, you're quickly back into a commodity inflation, a kind of supply shock phenomenon, which is going to put a damper on the ability and political willingness of central banks and fiscal authorities to continue to pursue an expansionary policy. And then there's the problem, finally, of the deepest urge of the political classes, which is to get back to their previous business, to declare victory, to have the problem over with, to find green shoots. I say green shoots is a nice expression for Ireland, but really, it's a deeply irresponsible thing for public authorities, even if they see them, to talk about them too much. Because it's a way of promoting complacency. It's an expression equivalent to the great 1920s, early 1930s phrase, prosperity is right around the corner. Hoover's excuse for doing nothing. On top of that, of course, the phobias of deficits and inflation and long-term interest rates, perhaps abetted by actions being taken in the financial markets by some players, are there and cause everybody to say reflexively, well, this is only for a couple of years and then we will get back to cutting expenditure and raising taxes, doing all kinds of unpleasant things that will, that did, when Roosevelt did them in 1937, produce a complete quick return to the Depression's most serious levels of unemployment. And I suspect that danger is also there. It's clearly there. What could and should have been done, and what I'll say now, it seems to me applies to the United States, but could also be applied in generic terms to the European policy problems as well. And first of all, with respect to the banks, a rapid resolution of the worst affected institutions would have given us a more efficient and competitive and sensible banking sector going forward, and one that would be better suited to the scale of finance in the future economy, which is clearly going to be smaller than it has been in the past. We're not going back to a world in which banking profits are 40% of total profits. Not going to happen. And so the question is, do we squeeze out the small banks or do we squeeze out the big banks, which are inherently dangerous and indeed rogue institutions in some respects, devoted to tax and regulatory arbitrage and deeply implicated in this whole mythology of quantitative risk assessment models? Much better to treat them like we treat other banks that get into trouble, take them over, do a change of the management, a clear audit, and assess what should be done with them from that point forward, including the possibility of maintaining essential infrastructure as a public utility. Secondly, the experience of the New Deal in the United States and the development of social welfare in the world gives us institutions which could be used much more effectively to stabilize things. Social insurance, Social Security in the U.S., simplest thing to do is to increase it. The income and wealth position of the elderly population has been collapsed. Housing, stocks, interest income, all gone. One thing that hasn't gone is social insurance. We're going to need more, not less, of commitment to social insurance programs. And we need to finance it not by the pretense that it's covered by payroll taxes, which are the regressive tax, the relief of which would bring immediate benefits to the working population. Foreclosures should be stopped, evictions anyway. Perhaps houses can be converted to rentals. But the point is, it makes no sense at all to allow massive empty, oversupply of empty houses, which immediately deteriorate and form a blight over entire neighborhoods and regions. And the protection of subnational units of government from their own fiscal problems, an immediate and essential step not taken yet. I've spoken about energy policy, and going beyond the immediate stabilization is the question of what kind of economy do we have going forward. It's clear that we're going to have to do something, and it's probably not going to be information technology, and it's not going to be housing finance, and it's not going to be banking per se. And the thing that we need to do, clearly, is address the overdependence on oil and coal, our carbon footprint, the greenhouse gas and climate change problem, and that there is a generation's worth of work that could be done if it could be organized under an appropriate institutional framework, both public and private. We haven't yet taken advantage of the crisis to put that framework in place. And I'll say, one other thing which is a little more speculative, but I think interesting particularly for a foreign policy audience. The United States plays a role in the world and has since 1945, which is asymmetric, which is a centerpiece, and certainly a centerpiece of the monetary system, first under Bretton Woods and then afterwards, since the 1980s, under a basically dollar reserve system. And it is a fragile system, it may be an unstable system, but it has its virtues. Right? Problem is what justifies it. Up until 1989, the Western alliance justified it. You could say, well, the U.S. was providing the linchpin of the security system, and therefore it made sense for it to be the centerpiece of the financial system. From 1989 until President Obama's speech yesterday in Cairo, you could argue that the U.S. was trying to persuade the world that a new crusade, a return to the Middle Ages, was going to be the sufficient reason for keeping us at the center of the world system. The world, by the way, did not find this to be a deeply persuasive argument. And President Obama's quite wisely now said, well, we're not going to do this anymore. We're going to rejoin the world in terms of having an appreciation of the actual realities and stop trying to buffalo the American people. And that speech, I think, was a very effective response, by the way, to former Vice President Cheney and his efforts to justify the kinds of things that they were doing. But that still leaves a question. If you're going to have a country providing the reserve currency, what is the reason for that country as opposed to another? And if we are not taking an initiative to solve problems that the world finds urgent, and what is more urgent than the climate problem? If in fact we are a country which is becoming predatory on the world, it hardly seems to me that that is conducive to the world being willing to put up with the dollar's advantages for an indefinite period. Maybe that the cost of changing still remain quite high, but it would be much better if you're going to preserve the system to provide an active justification for accepting it. I'll say, in very brief conclusion, that I think the Obama record so far is one of quite energetic and effective action, which has kept our economy and by extension to some degree the world economy from the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. But I think that the intermediate term objectives being pursued by that policy are simply not well defined or well conceived. The underlying implicit idea is that you can go back to the 1990s or the middle part of the 2000s and have a new credit expansion led by the same banking institutions towards some new technological or social objective, information or housing, something else. And I don't think that's a realistic probability, and the contradiction will become clear over time. And when that time has elapsed and it becomes necessary to assess, there are two possibilities. One is that we could have a kind of intellectual and political crisis as every snake oil salesman and every demagogue and populist and what have you comes in with every kind of easy fix, including, of course, massive tax reductions and all of the deregulatory nonsense of the previous generation gets restated. Or we can have a framework that's gradually put into place, which people can coalesce around, which gives us a sensible and potentially effective way forward. So this is Churchill, as you may recall, once said that America can always be counted on to do the best thing, the right thing, after it has exhausted all of the available alternatives. Let's just hope that that's still right. Thanks very much. Okay.